During this period, the government undertook an ambitious reform program to modernize France. This led to increased tensions among those opposed to these policies. Many émigrés left France and from exile became active opponents of the government. A number of the politicians of widely differing views urged war as a means of dealing with these opponents. The decision to go to war had momentous consequences for both France and Europe. The things examined in this section will be the outbreak of war, the overthrow of the monarchy, and the republic at war from 1792 to 1793. Despite mistrusting the king, it seemed likely that the Constitution of 1791 would survive. What prevented this was the outbreak of war with Austria in April 1792. This event had more decisive and far-reaching results than any other in the whole of the French Revolution. Almost everything that happened in France from that time was caused or was affected by this decision. The war finally destroyed the consensus of 1789. It led directly to the fall of the monarchy, to civil war, and to the terror. The great powers had shown no inclination to intervene during the first 2 years of the French Revolution. Leopold II, ruler of the Habsburg Empire, approved of many of the liberal reforms in the Revolution and did not want a return to absolutism in France. He, like other sovereigns, were pleased at the collapse of French power and no longer regarded France as a serious rival. In any case, Russia, Austria, and Prussia were preoccupied elsewhere. From 1787, Russia and Austria were at war with the Ottoman Empire. Leopold abandoned the fight in July 1790 to concentrate on Austria, Netherlands, the area between Holland and France, which 40 years later would become Belgium, where there was a revolt. He crushed this in the winter of 1790 and then turned his attention to Poland, where Russia and Prussia were seeking to gain territory. All three powers were eventually more interested in trying to secure a partition of Poland to their own advantage than in what was going on in France. After the royal family's flight, the Austrians felt they had to make some gesture in support of Louis. On the 27th of August 1791, they issued the Declaration of PILLNITZ in association with Prussia. This stated that both countries regarded the present situation of the French king of common interest to all European rulers. They hoped to restore the power of the French crown, and force would be used if necessary to bring about this restoration. The declaration was significant because it appeared to be a threat to interfere in French internal affairs. Enemies of the king considered that the declaration justified their opposition to and mistrust of the monarchy. In reality, however, it was no threat at all, since the Austrians knew that the other powers, such as Great Britain, would not join them. This meant that the declaration was unlikely to lead to any action. In France, the declaration did not create much of a stir. The Assembly did not debate it, and most newspapers ignored it. When the Constitution was passed in September, Leopold of the Habsburg Empire gave it a warm welcome, so the possibility of Austrian intervention was even more remote. Both Marie Antoinette and Louis supported the war only in that they hoped France would lose, and if France lost the war, then Louis could get his powers back. A lot of the army commanders also supported the war for several reasons and formed coalitions in order to pass it through the Assembly. They thought that a successful conflict would rouse enthusiasm for the revolution and show the permanence of the new regime. A war would allow France to extend its revolutionary ideas abroad. The French armies would have the active support of their enemies' own repressed subjects, and the internal situation was favorable as the European powers were unlikely to unite against France. Russia was preoccupied with Poland, and Britain would not join it unless its home security or empire was directly threatened. Most deputies were won over by the arguments, but some politicians outside the assembly were not. Robespierre expressed his attitude to the war in these terms: "You propose to give supreme power to those who most want your ruin? The only way to save the state and to safeguard freedom is to wage war in the right way, on our enemies at home, instead of marching under their orders against their allies across the frontier." He believed that the real threat came from soldiers like Lafayette, who were still popular enough to mislead the public. Robespierre believed that the aim of European powers was to intimidate France, not to invade her. War would be more difficult than moderates expected, because foreigners would not rise up in support of French invaders. Robespierre memorably observed, "No one loves armed missionaries." As a result of his opposition to war, Robespierre became an isolated and unpopular figure who was convinced that his opponents were plotting to betray the revolution. His relations with Lafayette and Brissot were poisoned by bitter personal quarrels and mutual suspicions. Having taken France into war, the early military engagements showed how badly prepared the French army was. Military defeat and desertion of many commanders to the enemy created great tension and fear in Paris that the capital would be captured. The royal family and Louis were suspected of being less than fully committed to gaining a French victory, and some of Louis's actions were seen as hostile to the revolution. In this climate, the king's political opponents became increasingly determined to overthrow the monarchy. When war was declared, the French army was far from ready. It was badly defeated. Of its 12,000 officers, half had emigrated. There were 150,000 men under arms in 1791, comprising both regular and newly recruited volunteers. However, a combination of desertion and revolutionary propaganda in many of the newspapers and magazines destroyed the discipline of the regular army, while the volunteers were poorly trained and equipped. When French forces advanced into Austrian Netherlands on April 20th, 1792, they were faced with a determined opposition. The army panicked and retreated, where they murdered their commander. Whole units deserted. By the end of May, all three field commanders were advising that peace should be immediately offered. The Allies counterattacked and invaded northern France. Treason and traitors were blamed for French defeats with some justification. Marie Antoinette had sent details of French military plans to the Austrians. While these defeats were occurring, the government had other problems to cope with as well. One of the things that was going on was the opposition from refractory priests and counter-revolutionaries. who wanted to restore the authority of the Catholic Church and the monarchy. Louis began to veto a series of legislation, which in a sense caused a lot of fear. When Louis refused to approve new laws that Lafayette proposed, he also then dismissed him and other ministers. They quickly resigned, and by June 19th, Louis vetoed the laws on refractory priests. There was an expectation of a military coup in support of the king and the Catholic Church. Leaders of the Paris sections responded to these events by holding an armed demonstration on the 20th of June, the anniversary of the tennis court oath. Their leaders came from the Cordeliers Club. The Jacobins did not get involved, as they had done earlier. About 8,000 demonstrators, many of them National Guards, poured into the Tuileries. The Tuileries was where the royal family was. Louis behaved with great dignity when they showed up. He was not intimidated, and his calmness may have saved his life. This mob did not achieve its desired end. The king did not withdraw his veto or recall his ministers. However, it did show very clearly the weakness of the king and the assembly and the growing power of these sections. The assembly soon took steps which recognized the growing importance of the SANS-CULOTTES, but which also increased the likelihood of a rising. On July 11th, it declared a state of emergency, which called on every Frenchman to fight. This tilted the balance of power in favor of those who called for greater democracy. How could you ask a man to fight and not give him the vote? The Paris sections, whose assemblies were allowed to meet in permanent session, demanded the admission of passive citizens into the assemblies and National Guard. These requests were granted by the end of the month. The bourgeoisie middle-class control of 1789 had begun to give way to popular democracy of the sans-culottes. Tension in Paris was increased by the arrival of the VETOES from the provinces in July 1793. The VETOES were militant revolutionaries and Republicans, unlike the Paris National Guard, whose officers were conservative or royalists. By July, their total number in Paris was over 5,000, and they were putting powerful pressure on the radical sections calling for the removal of the king. The situation in Paris was deteriorating rapidly, and extremists were becoming much more active in the political life of the capital. With a new insurrection being prepared by radicals, some argued that the king should be put on trial, and some tried to prevent a rising. They were alarmed that events were getting out of their control. Jacobin leaders warned the king that there were likely to be a more violent uprising and that it was very likely that he would be deposed. They offered to do all they could to prevent such an uprising. The Jacobin leader Robespierre, though, was cooperating with the Central Committee of the VETOES, and on July 29th, in a speech to the Jacobin Club, he put forward his proposals: abandonment of the Constitution of 1791, the overthrow of the monarchy, the establishment of a national convention elected by universal male suffrage to replace the Legislative Assembly, and a purge of the departmental authorities, many of which were royalist. Until this date, Robespierre had warned everyone, don't be hasty in action, as it might lead to a backlash in the king's favor, but now he felt the moment had come. On the night of August 9th, sans-culottes took over the Hôtel de Ville, expelled the city council, and set up a revolutionary commune. Among its leaders were Hebert, who had taken part in the Cordeliers agitation the previous year. The next morning, on August 10, 1792, several thousand National Guard, which was now open to passive citizens, and 2,000 VETOES, led by those from Marseille, marched on the Tuileries. The palace was defended by 3,000 troops, 2,000 of whom were National Guards. The others were Swiss mercenaries who were certain to resist. During the morning, the king sought refuge in the assembly to protect his family. The National Guard defending the Tuileries then joined the crowd who entered the courtyard. They believed the attack was over until the Swiss began to fire. The men from Marseille replied with grape shot, and it seemed that a violent battle was about to take place. At this point, the king ordered his Swiss guards to cease fire. This left them at the mercy of the attackers. 600 Swiss were massacred. Among the attackers, 90 VETOES and 300 Parisians had been killed or wounded. It was the bloodiest mob rule of the revolution. The rising was as much a rejection of the assembly as it was of the king. The rebels invaded the assembly and forced it to recognize the new revolutionary commune, which had given the orders for the attack on the palace. The deputies had to hand over the king to the commune, who imprisoned him in the temple. They also had to agree to an election by universal manhood suffrage for a national convention that was to draw up a new democratic constitution. The commune was now in control of Paris, though in the rest of France it was the authority of the assembly alone that was recognized. Following the overthrow of Louis, the constitutional monarchs that were deputies in the assembly fled or went into hiding. This left the Girondins in charge, and they pretty much did whatever the Paris Commune wanted. They also did a surprise appointment, and that was they made Danton the Minister of Justice. He was appointed so as to appease the SANS-CULOTTES. In its final 6 weeks before the National Convention, the Assembly did all that the Paris Commune wanted. It passed several radical measures. Refractory priests who did not leave France were to be deported to the French colony of Guyana. They abolished all the feudal dues, finally, every single one of them. House-to-house searches ordered for arms and suspects, and many were arrested. And divorce was legalized. Registration of births, deaths, and marriages became a state responsibility rather than a church one. After the 10th of August, Louis was suspended from exercising his powers. It was left for the National Convention to decide whether or not to dethrone him. The convention met for the first time on the 20th of September, 1792. By then, there was little doubt that Louis would be deposed. Royal documents found in the Tuileries after August 10th confirmed what was widely suspected. The king had behaved treacherously in that he had maintained links with France's enemies. Elections were held for deputies to the convention using universal manhood suffrage, although many with royalist sympathies were disenfranchised. Thus, all the members were either Jacobins, Republicans, or supporters of the Commune. Robespierre's, for instance, came ahead of the poll in the capital. So much of this period is marked by the struggle between the Girondins and the Jacobins, and also it's really hard to tell at any one time where a deputy stood within the convention as a result of the shifting power. The Jacobins insisted on a trial of the king in order to establish the Republic more firmly. While Louis remained alive, it might be easier for the Royalists to plot a restoration. The sans-culottes, upon whom the Jacobins came to rely more and more, wanted the king tried and executed, as they held him responsible for the bloodshed at the Tuileries on August 10, 1792. The Girondins tried to prevent a trial and, when they were unable to do this, made 2 attempts to save Louis's life. The first one suggested that the king's fate should be decided by a referendum. When this was rejected, the king was found guilty and sentenced to death. They then proposed a reprieve. Two factors sealed Louis's fate. The first was the incriminating royal correspondence between Louis and the Austrian royal family, revealed documents which were carefully examined by a special commission set up by the convention. The second was Murat's proposal that a decision should be reached so that traitors in the assembly may be known. In an assembly of 749 deputies, no one voted that Louis was innocent, while 693 voted that he was guilty. When it came to the sentence, 387 voted unconditionally for the death penalty and 288 for imprisonment. The convention then voted against a reprieve by 380 votes to 310. What the voting patterns reveal is that there was a solid block of moderates in the convention who were reluctant to support the execution of the king. Louis was executed on the morning of January 21, 1793. As St. Just said, he was executed not for what he had done, but for what he was, a menace to the Republic. An alternative view is that Louis was executed because of his actions in the period after 1789 showed that he was just not to be trusted. This was for all intents and purposes confirmed by the discovery of incriminating letters. Securing the execution of Louis was the first Jacobin victory in the convention, and it left the factions more hostile to one another than ever. Although over half the Girondin leaders, including Brissot, had voted for the death penalty, they were branded as royalist and counter-revolutionaries by the more radical Jacobins. By securing Louis's execution, the radical Jacobins, or the Mountains, gained an ascendancy in the convention, which they rarely lost afterwards. Brissot hardly spoke there after the trial. In the summer of 1792, the situation on the French armies on the frontier was desperate. Lafayette had defected to the Austrians on the 17th of August. With a leading general deserting, who could still be trusted? Panic and fear of treachery swept the country. This was increased when the Prussians crossed the French frontier and captured part of France. By the beginning of September, Verdun, the last major fortress on the road to Paris, was about to surrender. The French capital was under immediate threat from enemy forces, and the revolution itself was in danger of being overthrown by foreign powers. In this worsening situation, with panic and desperation setting in, the authorities appealed to the forces of nationalism and patriotism. The Paris Commune called on all patriots to take up arms. Thousands volunteered to defend the capital and the revolution. But once they had left for the front, there was growing concern about the overcrowded prisons, which contained many priests and nobles as counter-revolutionary suspects. A rumor arose that they were plotting to escape, kill the helpless population, and hand the city over to the Prussians. Murat, a powerful figure in the Commune, called for the conspirators to be killed. The massacres of prisoners was the first appearance of the terror. It began on September 2nd and continued for 5 days. Between 1,100 and 1,400 of the 2,600 prisoners in Paris jails were murdered. Only a quarter were priests and nobles. The rest were common criminals. The killers were the SANS-CULOTTES of the Paris sections. The Commune made no attempt to stop them, neither did Danton, the Minister of Justice. This would have meant mobilizing the National Guard and risking another massacre. So this, in a sense, cast a shadow over the first meeting of the convention. Most deputies from the provinces were shocked by the killings and rallied to the Girondins. The hatred of the Girondins for the Jacobins and their sans-culotte supporters was intensified. From now on, moderates and foreign opinion regarding the Mountains and the sans-culotte as bloodthirsty murderers. Just as the fortunes of war had brought about the September massacres, they also brought about an end to this first phase of terror, at least for the meantime. They won a huge victory against Prussian troops at the Battle of Valmy. This was a very significant victory. If the Prussians had won, there was little doubt that Paris would have fallen. This would have probably meant the end of the revolution. But they didn't. They won, and the new forces summoned by the decree of July 1792 were very effective, particularly as they were supplemented by many volunteers and National Guardsmen. The French Republic would not be easily defeated. Brunswick, the Prussian commander-in-chief, retreated to the frontier. French armies once again took the offensive, and within a month, they reconquered all of the territory in France. In November, they defeated the Austrians and occupied most of Belgium. This was the first major battle won by the Republican forces. With the Republic apparently secure from external threat, the government now began to talk about expanding the reach of France to their natural frontiers. These are the areas that belonged to other countries but bordered France, which included the Rhine region, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. And in January 1793, it passed a decree claiming them for France. This would mean annexing territory, which was contrary to the policy laid down by the Constituent Assembly in May of 1790, when they said the French nation renounces involvement in any war undertaken with the aim of making conquest. The change in policy was accomplished by propaganda. On the 19th of November 1792, the convention issued the Decree of Fraternity, which promised to extend fraternal feelings and aid to all peoples who may wish to regain their liberty. Some politicians were attracted to the prospect of extending the revolution to other states. Brissot wrote, "We can only be at peace once Europe is blazing from end to end." He argued that as long as France was under threat from hostile monarchs, there would be little prospect of security. But in these monarchs could be defeated, the Republic would be secure. Avignon, which had been a papal territory in France since 1273, had been annexed in 1791. Savoy was annexed in November 1792, and Nice in January 1793. These were the first foreign territories to be added to the Republic. A revolutionary administration was set up in the conquered lands. French armies had to be paid for and fed at the expense of the local population. Church lands and those belonging to enemies of the new regime were confiscated. Tithes and feudal dues were abolished. These measures alienated much of the population and confirmed Robespierre's prediction that French armies would not be welcome abroad. The Republican Convention posed a threat to European powers everywhere. The great powers were alarmed at the annexation of Nice and Savoy. Great Britain was particularly concerned at France's extension to the Rhine, as this would lead to the annexation of a large part of the United Provinces, as well as the whole of Austrian Netherlands. William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, was determined that both of these should be kept out of French hands, since they possessed good ports from which to launch any potential invasion of Great Britain. They were seen as central to Britain's security, not only in the English Channel, but also on the routes to India. The British also disliked the French reopening the River Scheldt to navigation. The convention unanimously declared war on Great Britain and Holland on February 1st, 1793. The Spanish royal family, who were related to the French Bourbons, were shocked at the execution of Louis and expelled the French envoy. When it appeared that Spain was preparing to join an anti-French alliance, in March the convention declared war on their southern neighbor. With the exception of Switzerland, Sweden, and Denmark, France was at war with most of Europe. The French misunderstood the situation in Britain. They mistakenly thought that there would be a revolution there. They also thought that in war Britain would crumble as Prussia and Austria had done. The British, for their part, thought the French was bankrupt and on the verge of civil war. Each believed that the war would be short and easy and entered into it confidently. The first coalition emerged slowly between March and September 1793. Britain was the driving force binding the other powers together, as there was no formal treaty. Her diplomacy persuaded a number of other countries to join the anti-French crusade. The campaign in 1793 began very badly for the French. An attack against Holland failed, and the French commander Dumouriez was defeated by the Austrians in March. Following his defeat, he reached an agreement with the Austrian commander and planned to march on Paris, dissolve the convention, and restore the Constitution of 1791 and the monarchy. His actions prompted some politicians to suspect the loyalty of the army commanders. When his armies refused to follow him, Dumouriez deserted to the Austrians along with the Duc de Chartres. Chartres was the son of the Duc d'Orléans, who later became King Louis-Philippe of France. Since the Girondins had enthusiastically backed Dumouriez, his defection was very important as it further weakened their position in the convention and within the Paris clubs. Meanwhile, the French lost Belgium and left the bank of the Rhine bordering their country. Once again, there was fighting on French soil. Leading figures such as Danton were urging conciliation rather than confrontation. With the military situation deteriorating rapidly, a large rebellion broke out. Lazare Carnot was a military engineer and served as a captain in the Royal Army. During the Revolution, he was elected firstly to the Legislative Assembly and following the overthrow of the monarchy to the National Convention. As the military situation deteriorated, Carnot's military skills were called into use. He was sent to the south to organize the defenses of the area against a possible attack from Spain. During the trial of Louis XVI, Carnot voted for the king's execution. Although his political inclination was towards the center, he did lean towards the Jacobins by 1793. In the summer of 1793, he joined the Committee of Public Safety, and his military expertise was put to good use. He studied the military problems facing the Republic and presented a number of reports to the CPS. Following one such report, 82 representatives were sent into departments to speed up the conscription of 300,000 men into the army. The military front causing the greatest concern to the Republic was in the north. He was sent by the CPS to lend his support to this demoralized and dispirited army. The essence of his contribution was reorganizing the army, reestablishing discipline, and leading by example in military engagements. Before joining the Army of the North, Austrian forces were besieging the area. Following the measures suggested by Carnot, the siege was raised and enemy forces were defeated by October of 1793. During this campaign, Carnot fought alongside the generals and was in the heart of the action. He made a vital contribution to the eventual success of the campaign and was honored with the description of Organizer of Victory. By the winter of 1792 and 1793, the counter-revolution in France had virtually collapsed. It is appropriate to describe the Vendee as an anti-revolution rather than a counter-revolution, in that it was directed more against the revolution and its demands rather than for the restoration of the ancient regime. The basic causes of the uprising were the extension of the war and the interdiction of conscription. The government ordered a levy of 300,000 troops in February of 1793. This triggered a massive uprising on the 11th of March 1793 in 4 departments south of the Loire and in what became known as the Vendee militaire, or simply the Vendee. In reality, discontent in the Vendee had been present long before 1793 and the proposed conscription. Since 1789, peasants in the area had found themselves paying more in the new land tax than they had paid under the old tax system. They came to dislike the revolutionary government, and with the introduction of the civil constitution of the clergy, this dislike turned to hatred and open hostility. The religious changes were strongly resisted in Vendee, which was deeply attached to the Catholic Church, and there were many non-juring priests in the area. The sale of church lands was also unpopular because most were bought by the bourgeoisie of towns, who then often raised the rents. Those who bought land became supporters of the revolution, which was a guarantee they could keep this land. Those who were not successful became hostile to the government. The peasants looked to the nobles as their natural leaders. Many of these were monarchists, so the rising became caught up in the counter-revolution. New local officials, constitutional priests, and national guards were massacred. The situation was so serious that in May, the government had to withdraw 30,000 troops from the front just to deal with the rising. Yet the rebels were never a serious threat to the government in Paris. They were ill-disciplined, better at guerrilla warfare than set peace battles, and unwilling to move far from their homes. The economic problems that the war had created added to the difficulties of the government. To pay for the war, more and more money was printed, which reduced the value of those already in circulation. By February 1793, the purchasing power of the money had fallen by 50%. This pushed up prices as more money was needed to buy goods. The harvest in 1792 was good, but bread was scarce. St. Just pointed out why in a speech in November 1792. He said the farmer does not want to save paper money, and for this reason he is most reluctant to sell his grain. The results of high prices and scarcity were, as usual, widespread riots against grain stores and demands from the SANS-CULOTTES for price controls and requesting new products. Of greater concern to the French government was that the war against the Allies continued to go badly in the summer of 1793. The Austrians pushed into France. The Spaniards invaded from the south. The Allies had 160,000 men on the Netherlands border with France. If the Allies had only worked together, they could have turned on Paris and France would have faced a disaster. Fortunately for them, the Allies did not coordinate their plans. The British decided to take Dunkirk as a port for a naval base, so they turned west, the Austrians turned east, and the Allied army broke into two. This enormous blunder saved France. In conclusion, a lot of things are happening in these years between 1792 and 1793. At war, you have a military crisis with a lot of the officers leaving for the Austrian side. Then you have the Battle of Valmy, which is, a great victory for France, and suddenly they're feeling a lot better. And then they decide to extend their reach. So rather than defending their revolution, they begin to expand in 3 different directions and, issue the decree of fraternity, which in a sense then causes eventual war with Great Britain, Holland, and Spain. War goes very badly for France, and they're saved really by a lack of coordination from the Allies. At home, they have the September massacres where thousands and thousands of political prisoners, or just actually prisoners, are murdered in a week's period. Then, because a lot of the reason the war is going badly, you get popular dissent in places like the Vendee rebellion, which almost becomes a part of the counter-revolution. So things are looking pretty bleak for France as we move into 1793, which might, and don't forget they're also having economic problems, so that might explain why we see a radical shift in ideas within the revolution.